You don't believe in curses. Not really. Not the kind that reach across centuries, pulling at your breath like invisible fingers. But try explaining that to the man whose dog howled non-stop the night he died, or to the radiologist whose skin turned yellow under the Cairo sun weeks after opening a sealed tomb. Try saying it wasn't real while reading the autopsy of a man who choked to death on invisible air. One tomb, one boy king. One by one they fell. Not in battle, not in rebellion, but in drawing rooms, hotel beds, and private trains. Quiet, unseen. As if something ancient had been disturbed and wanted the world to know. Take a slow breath. Let the desert wind settle. The fever of those first headlines has long faded, but the story they whispered into the bones of history still lingers. Tonight, we don't run from the myth. We step into it. Picture this: 1922. The Valley of the Kings. A land that feels older than memory, where even the stones seem to whisper. British archaeologist Howard Carter stands at the edge of a forgotten doorway, half buried in sand, the painted seal still unbroken. Behind him, his patron Lord Carnarvon leans in with the kind of anticipation only the ultra-wealthy can afford to feel. They don't yet know what they've found, not really. But within days, the world will. They will peer into the tomb of Tutankhamun, a boy king dead for over 3,000 years. They will see gold, masks, lapis eyes that never blink. And they will see death, just not the kind they expected. Because within months, Carnarvon will be dead. Strange, sudden, then others. Dozens. Some close to the tomb, some merely associated. An outbreak of coincidence, some say. A pattern of dread, say others. But what if it wasn't just a story the press spun into smoke and superstition? What if the pharaohs meant every word they carved in stone? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Tonight we peel back the linen wrappings of a legend. We step gently over the threshold of a sealed chamber, and we ask a question that has refused to die for over a century. Did the curse of the pharaohs really exist? And if so, who or what was it trying to protect? The first death came quickly. Just 4 months after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon, financial backer of the expedition, was dead. The official cause, blood poisoning stemming from an infected mosquito bite that he accidentally nicked while shaving. Harmless until it wasn't. A freak infection, the doctors said. But then came the murmurs. On the night of his death, the lights in Cairo reportedly blacked out. Back in England, his dog let out a long, eerie howl and collapsed. Carter, the archaeologist who had led the dig, said nothing to the press. But those around him noted a sudden coldness in his demeanor, as if some shadow had passed over him. Then more deaths followed, falling like dominoes across continents. George J. Gould, the American railroad tycoon who visited the tomb shortly after its opening, developed a fever and died in the French Riviera. Arthur Mace, a fellow archaeologist, succumbed to arsenic poisoning. A radiologist who x-rayed the mummy, Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, died under strange circumstances not long after the procedure. The Count of Carnarvon's half-brother was found dead in his apartment, slumped over papers detailing the tomb's artifacts. There was even a member of the excavation team who legend holds was so haunted by the experience he threw himself under a train. 1 or 2 odd deaths coincidence. A dozen, that's a pattern. Or at least it begins to feel like one, especially when fueled by a public already obsessed with the mystical aura of ancient Egypt. The Victorians had long been entranced by pyramids, scarabs, and mummies. Egyptian revival architecture lined the streets of London. Cleopatra costumes dazzled masquerade balls. But now the fascination had turned sour. The tomb of Tutankhamun wasn't just a historical discovery. It was beginning to feel like a portal to something best left buried. What makes this sequence of deaths so gripping is how varied they were. Some dropped within weeks, others months. One man reportedly died after reading a translated warning allegedly found on the tomb wall. The curse, it seemed, was not picky. Age, nationality, profession, it didn't matter. And the fear spread far beyond those who had physically entered the tomb. Journalists, financiers, museum curators, and even guests at dinner parties, where artifacts were merely displayed, reported strange illnesses, accidents, and dreams. Yet for all the grim storytelling, there's a pattern that refuses to settle cleanly into place. Some who were closest to the tomb, like Howard Carter himself, lived for years after the excavation, relatively undisturbed. Carter died of lymphoma in 1939, nearly 2 decades later. Was he spared by some unseen mercy? Or perhaps was the danger never truly supernatural at all? Historians have spent decades attempting to chart the curse's timeline, cross-referencing deaths with proximity to the tomb. Some believe the media exaggerated many connections. Others suggest there was a psychological effect at play, known today as the nocebo response. If you believe a curse will kill you, your body may start to behave as though it's true. It's not mystical, it's neurological. The brain becomes a poison of its own making. Still, there are a few deaths that remain stubbornly difficult to dismiss. A French Egyptologist who mocked the curse collapsed during a lecture. A museum guard transporting a sealed crate of artifacts reportedly died the next morning. Even a young Egyptian boy who was part of the dig team drowned in the Nile under murky circumstances. These aren't just stories, they're fragments in a growing mosaic of dread. What's even more unsettling is how often the number rises depending on who's counting. Some lists include up to 25 names. Others go beyond 30. The threshold for who counts as a victim is loose. Must they have entered the tomb, touched an object, funded the dig, or merely known someone who did? The wider the net is cast, the more persuasive the pattern becomes, but also the more diluted. And then there's the question nobody ever seems eager to ask: who benefits from the curse, not in the tomb, but outside it? The deaths, grim as they were created, an unstoppable media machine. Headlines blazed across Europe and America. Museums competed for scraps of Egyptian antiquity. Tourists poured into Luxor by the boatload. The mystery wasn't just terrifying, it was profitable. Still, even the most skeptical voices in archaeology admit there's something odd about the sequence. The tomb, after all, had remained sealed for over 3,000 years. Its contents, golden shrines, chariots, daggers, lotus blossom necklaces, seemed untouched by time. A boy king frozen in eternity. And yet within months of his resting place being disturbed, bodies were falling. Not in the sand, but in offices, train cars, and bathtubs. Not in war, but in silence. We are left with a question that continues to pulse beneath the surface of history. Were these deaths merely a string of bad luck amplified by fevered headlines? Or was something older and more deliberate at work? Something that moved unseen, patient, precise, and deeply offended. It's tempting to imagine that the idea of a pharaoh's curse was conjured in the smoky backroom of a Fleet Street newsroom, part invention, part spectacle. But that would be doing the ancient Egyptians a grave disservice. Because long before the tomb of Tutankhamun became a tourist attraction and a ghost story, the Egyptians were already writing warnings to the living. You just had to know how to read them. The ancient world didn't have the word curse in the way modern horror movies use it. No green lightning bolts, no vengeful mummies groaning in the dark. Instead, their inscriptions, usually in neat hieroglyphs carved into limestone, often spoke of wrath, protection, or divine punishment. These were not threats in the Hollywood sense. They were warnings embedded in religion. To disturb the dead was to trespass against the gods, and trespass had consequences slow, spiritual, inescapable. One inscription from the tomb of Anctify, a provincial governor during the First Intermediate Period, reads, "Any ruler who shall do evil to my tomb, may the crocodile be against him in the water, the serpent on land. May he have no tomb, no son." That doesn't scream subtlety. And while it predates Tutankhamun by centuries, the tone was consistent across eras. Tombs were sacred, and violating them risked cosmic backlash, not just personal ruin, but family extinction, divine exile. Still, one might ask, did Tutankhamun's tomb contain any such inscription? That's the strange part. Despite the wealth of objects within the burial chamber, there is no known curse explicitly written on its walls. No death shall come on swift wings, as many tabloids famously claimed. That quote almost certainly invented by a newspaper. And yet the absence of an explicit curse only deepened the fear. What if the warning wasn't meant for mortal eyes? Egyptian burial rites were layered, symbolic, and often intentionally cryptic. Much of what was meant to be seen was written in the tomb's outer chambers, while what was meant to be felt, the spells, the protections, the invocations, were embedded in the placement of objects, the orientation of the sarcophagus, the choice of amulets, even the sequence of rituals performed during burial. To break that sequence, to move the wrong item at the wrong time, might have been seen not merely as theft, but as a rupture in cosmic order. The Book of the Dead, a kind of ancient spiritual survival manual, contains dozens of spells designed to protect the deceased in the afterlife, but also to repel intruders. One passage warns, "I will not allow him to come in. I will not let his soul breathe." Not exactly a warm welcome for the curious archaeologist. And then there were the execration texts, curses written on pottery or figurines representing enemies, which were then smashed in ritual destruction. These weren't buried with the dead, but were used to neutralize threats in life. Still, they show a cultural fluency with symbolic punishment. Magic wasn't a parlor trick, it was policy. Scholars today remain divided. Some argue that the so-called curses were simply cultural expressions of respect for the dead, with no intention of actual harm. Others, particularly those focused on Egypt's mortuary traditions, insist that these rituals were believed to have real, tangible power, not metaphorical consequences, but actual effects on the physical world. The ancient Egyptians were not dabbling, they were invoking. One lesser-known detail is the role of guardian spells. These were spoken, sometimes sung by temple priests during burial, and were designed to call upon protective deities, Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, or Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and plague. Sekhmet in particular was feared for her rage. Legends say she once drank blood until she lost herself in frenzy. To call her forth as a protector was not a polite request. It was an invitation to fury. Even the architecture played a role in warding off intruders. Corridors narrowed into blind corners. Traps were sometimes set, not the swinging blade kind, but architectural dead ends meant to confuse and delay. Some tombs even had false burial chambers complete with decoy sarcophagi and false walls painted with decoy spells. Not to protect gold necessarily, but to protect silence. It's here that we might recall a detail from the previous chapter. The deaths began not only with those who entered the tomb, but also with those who handled the artifacts far away from Egypt. That raises a curious possibility. If the curse or whatever passed for one was less a physical inscription and more a spiritual presence embedded in the objects themselves, then perhaps it didn't need to be written on the wall. Perhaps it traveled with the gold, the alabaster, the wrapped bones of a forgotten king. This notion, while unsettling, finds a curious echo in Carter's own behavior. He was famously meticulous, some say obsessive, about the order in which artifacts were removed and catalogued. He even kept certain items hidden from Egyptian authorities for years, locked away in his personal crates. Was this a form of protection? Or was he afraid of something deeper, something even he didn't fully understand? We are left once again with a split in the stone. On one side, the absence of a formal curse. On the other, a culture that layered its warnings in ritual silence and shadow. So maybe the better question isn't whether the curse was real, but whether we ever knew how to recognize it. If the curse was real, even metaphorically, no one stood closer to its edge than Howard Carter. The man who found the tomb, opened the door, and first stared into wonderful things, became the epicenter of both awe and anxiety. And yet in the years that followed, Carter said surprisingly little about the deaths surrounding him. No statements to the press about the so-called curse. No attempts to correct the record. He simply went quiet. It wasn't a silence born of modesty. Carter was known to be prickly, even combative. He had clashed with Egyptian authorities over artifact ownership. He resented journalists who poked too close. And yet, when it came to the growing list of fatalities, he demurred. A man who had just uncovered the greatest archaeological find of the century offered no public defense of the tomb's innocence. That silence rang louder than words. Behind closed doors, Carter kept meticulous records. His excavation journals, still preserved, show a man obsessed with detail measurements, sketches, lighting conditions, even humidity levels. But when you reach the dates surrounding Lord Carnarvon's death, the very moment the curse story explodes, those entries become sparse. Entire days pass without notation. The tone shifts. It's not a blackout, but it's a dimming. And Carter's behavior shifted too. Friends noted that he became more guarded, more withdrawn. He moved his living quarters away from the Valley of the Kings and stopped attending certain social events. Some whispered that he'd become ill, but no diagnosis was ever shared. One letter written to a colleague months later simply read, "There are things best left untouched. I now believe that more fully than ever. No context, no elaboration, just a sentence folded into time." Carter also made a curious choice one historians still puzzle over. Though the tomb contained hundreds of items, including some of the finest treasures ever unearthed, Carter kept a small collection of personal artifacts stored in secret crates under his control. These items, including a few amulets, a statue fragment, and a mysterious alabaster jar, were not immediately declared to Egyptian antiquities authorities. They were eventually returned quietly years later. But why hold them back, and why those specific pieces? One of the artifacts, the alabaster jar, bore no inscriptions and had no clear purpose. Carter simply referred to it in his private notes as unsettling. When later examined, it was found to contain a residue, a black tar-like substance with no known match in the tomb's other objects. Nothing overtly supernatural. Just strange, uncatalogued, unexplained. There's also the story of Carter's pet canary. Legend has it that the day he opened the tomb, a cobra, the symbol of royal vengeance in ancient Egypt, slithered into his home and swallowed the bird whole. The cobra, sacred emblem of the Pharaohs, was viewed as a spiritual guardian. Killing one was considered a terrible omen. For the cobra to arrive uninvited the very day the tomb was unsealed felt to many like a message. Carter never mentioned it publicly, but he never replaced the canary either. Of course, skeptics argue that Carter's silence was simply strategic. The excavation was under constant political pressure. Egypt was asserting sovereignty over its antiquities. The British were clinging to influence. Any public acknowledgement of a curse could undermine the scientific legitimacy of the dig, or worse, spark calls for its immediate closure. So Carter may have chosen silence not out of fear, but necessity. And yet the air around him thickened. Visitors noted how Carter began carrying incense sticks into the tomb even after the initial cataloging was complete. He claimed it was to combat the smell of mildew and decay. But incense, especially Kai-Fi, the sacred mixture of frankincense, myrrh, and juniper, was also used in ancient rituals to ward off restless spirits. Whether Carter believed in that symbolism is unknowable, but he used it just the same. The greatest mystery, perhaps, is this: why did the man who opened the tomb, who physically broke the seal of eternity, seem so untouched by the curse himself? Was he immune by chance, protected by some unknown rite? Or was his life marked in other ways, quiet, slow, psychological? Carter lived until 1939, dying of lymphoma. It was a mundane end for a man wrapped in mystery. But in his final years, he gave no interviews, wrote no memoir, answered no lingering questions. His last known letter was addressed to a colleague in the British Museum. In it, he mentioned only this: "I have not returned to the valley, and I do not plan to." Whether that absence was an act of defiance, guilt, or caution remains a matter of interpretation. What's clear is this for a man who spent decades pursuing the truth of the dead: Howard Carter seemed deeply uncomfortable with the legacy he'd uncovered. We are left with a man standing at the threshold of wonder and walking away with more silence than treasure. And in that silence, the shadow of the curse only grows longer. For those unwilling to attribute the post-excavation deaths to a supernatural force but still unconvinced by sheer coincidence, there exists a third path, one paved not with magic or metaphor, but microbes. It's a theory that trades Pharaoh's wrath for fungal spores and buried toxins, the toxic tomb hypothesis. It begins with a simple premise. Sealed underground for over 3,000 years, these tombs were more than just homes for the dead. They were ecosystems. Microclimates formed within the chambers, thick with moisture decay and the invisible byproducts of decomposition. Papyrus scrolls, linens, animal offerings, human remains, all of it locked away in airtight darkness, waiting. When disturbed, the ancient air was not just stale, it was potentially deadly. Some scientists propose that Carter and his team may have unleashed a chemical or biological hazard upon opening the tomb. One suspect is Aspergillus flavus, a strain of fungus known to produce aflatoxins, one of the most potent carcinogens in nature. Inhaling a cloud of these spores in an enclosed chamber could lead to respiratory failure, immune suppression, or slow-moving infections difficult to diagnose at the time. And remember, this was the early 1920s. Penicillin wouldn't be widely used for another 2 decades. If you got sick, you stayed sick. Another possibility lies in Stachybotrys, a toxic black mold that thrives in damp, low-oxygen conditions. While modern buildings have suffered from its effects, imagine what it could do when concentrated for millennia inside a burial chamber full of organic material. The idea that the tomb's silence was broken not by vengeful spirits, but by a cloud of invisible spores, suddenly makes ancient malice feel strangely modern. Chemical hazards are another angle. Arsenic was often used in the mummification process, not just in ancient Egypt, but in later preservation efforts during colonial excavation. Mercury, too, was known to have been present in burial resins. Over time, these substances could crystallize or form toxic dust. Imagine brushing dust from a coffin lid, only to inhale a whisper of mercury vapor. The tomb, in this view, becomes not haunted, but hazardous. This theory gained traction in the 1980s when German microbiologist Dr. Gotthard Kramer studied spores found on ancient mummies and concluded that such pathogens could cause illness or death in people with weakened immune systems. His research, though not definitive, gave new weight to the idea that the Pharaoh's curse might be a poetic way of describing a biological event. And here's where it gets interesting. The very people who died after exposure to the tomb were often those in closest proximity to fragile materials, textiles, bones, sealed containers. Lord Carnarvon, who lingered in the tomb for hours during the early days of excavation, suffered from chronic respiratory issues. Arthur Mace, who died of arsenic poisoning, had handled a number of preserved artifacts by hand. Even the radiologist Sir Archibald Douglas Reed was among the first to X-ray the mummy itself, meaning he would have broken the seal on the wrappings, potentially disturbing embedded pathogens. Still, as with all neat theories, this one frays at the edges. Howard Carter himself remained largely healthy despite spending more time in the tomb than anyone. So did many Egyptian workers. The toxic tomb theory can explain some patterns, but not all. And that's where its credibility falters, like a theory almost right, but not quite enough to seal the lid. Skeptics also point out that many of the tomb's visitors lived full, robust lives. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter, and one of the first to enter the tomb, lived until 1980. Her presence inside the tomb's inner sanctum, without protection gloves or a mask, didn't seem to harm her at all. Was her youth a factor, her genetics, or was the tomb simply not as toxic as feared? And then there's the psychological layer, the idea that fear itself could weaken the body. The nocebo effect, a cousin to the placebo, is well documented. Believing that something will harm you can, in subtle and not so subtle ways, make your body behave as if it's under attack. Increased cortisol, suppressed immunity, cardiac stress. Imagine believing you've been cursed, then developing a fever. Is it fungus? Or fear? The toxic theory, while satisfying in its pragmatism, comes with a strange irony. It makes the curse no less real. Because whether it's bacteria, fungi, mercury, or hysteria, people still died. And those deaths still created the aura of doom that enveloped the tomb like a second sarcophagus. The pharaohs didn't need to reach from the afterlife. All they needed was time and the perfect atmospheric conditions. There's one final obscure footnote in this line of inquiry. Years after the initial dig, an unopened jar was found mislabeled in a university archive. It had been taken from the site by a visiting academic and forgotten for decades. Inside was a dark powder later identified as natron mixed with bitumen and trace amounts of lead. Harmless, maybe. Or maybe part of a compound once used to coat mummy wrappings, preserving the dead while slowly poisoning the living. We may never know whether the tomb's danger came from the spirit world or the microscopic one. But when Carter broke the seal, he didn't just open a door to the past. He unleashed a living environment that had evolved in silence, waiting patiently. Not for revenge, just for breath. If the tomb of Tutankhamun was a powder keg of mystery, then the media was the match that lit it. From the moment the first photographs emerged, golden shrines, sculpted deities, jeweled masks, editors around the world realized they weren't just reporting on archaeology. They were printing myth. The death of Lord Carnarvon provided the perfect first act, an exotic setting, a nobleman's tragic end, a tomb sealed for millennia. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Within hours of Carnarvon's passing, newspapers began using the word curse. One London paper claimed a pharaoh's revenge had begun. Another spoke of the mummy's whisper. The New York Times printed a breathless account of mysterious forces haunting the tomb. Some of these papers had reporters stationed in Egypt. Most did not. But in the Roaring Twenties, the facts were secondary to the drama. The public wanted wonder and horror. Arthur Weigel, an Egyptologist turned journalist who had once worked with Carter, fanned the flames. He publicly declared that Carnarvon's death was predicted by the tomb's mystical protections. Should he enter that sacred threshold, Weigel supposedly wrote, "He shall surely die." Whether or not he said those words is debatable. What matters is that the public believed he did. The press had every reason to sensationalize. Egypt was fashionable. Mummies were cinematic. The silent film era had already delivered The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Nosferatu audiences were primed for shadows and specters. And into this cultural moment dropped a story with all the elements of Gothic fiction, conveniently dressed in foreign mystery, and just enough death to stir the imagination. Curse or no curse, it sold papers. And fast. In this haze of reporting, truths blurred. For example, the infamous phrase, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's peace," was repeatedly cited as an inscription above the tomb's entrance. It wasn't. There is no such inscription. It appears to have been fabricated by a journalist or generously misremembered from another site entirely. But it stuck. It felt right. So it stayed. The media also engaged in strategic omission. While some deaths were splashed across headlines in dramatic fashion, George J. Gould's fever, maces poisoning others that didn't fit the narrative, were ignored. Those who lived long, healthy lives after entering the tomb were footnotes at best. Carter himself, stubbornly undead, was seen as an anomaly rather than a contradiction. And then there were the illustrations. Artists rendered scenes of ancient gods stalking the tomb jackals with glowing eyes, sarcophagi shrouded in vapor. These weren't archaeological reconstructions. They were nightmares in ink, but they gave form to the fear. The Pharaohs' curse wasn't just a story, it was an aesthetic. And once that aesthetic entered public consciousness, it refused to leave. Even respectable publications like the Illustrated London News began framing Tutankhamun's legacy in terms of mysticism and foreboding. Accompanying real photographs of the tomb were captions speculating on spiritual safeguards and hidden maledictions. The tone wasn't tabloid, it was reverent. But the effect was the same awe seasoned with dread. This wasn't just limited to Europe and America. Egyptian newspapers, particularly in Cairo, began printing both fascination and resentment. Some local voices warned that the desecration of tombs would anger the gods. Others criticized the British-led excavation as a new kind of imperial theft, wrapped in scholarly pretense but rooted in greed. In this environment, the idea of a curse began to serve multiple functions: a punishment, a protest, a parable. And as the story spread, the body count grew. Or at least it seemed to. When a man connected to the tomb died, it made news. When someone unconnected to the site died, but could be linked to someone who was, they made news too. By the end of the decade, nearly 30 names had been loosely associated with the Pharaoh's curse, even if some had never set foot in Egypt. But once myth has momentum, logic struggles to keep up. One curious moment came when Sir Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a known spiritualist, was asked about the curse. He responded earnestly, suggesting that Carnarvon's death might have been the work of elementals, ancient spiritual guardians attached to the tomb. When a man famous for cold rationalism gave credence to such an idea, the legend deepened its roots. What's easy to forget now is how tightly controlled the excavation actually was. Howard Carter, after an early scuffle with Egyptian authorities, restricted press access to the tomb. Only selected journalists were permitted inside. Photographs were limited. Details were drip-fed. In that vacuum, speculation bloomed. And in a way, Carter's secrecy only added to the illusion that something was being hidden, something too dangerous to be spoken. Looking back, it's hard not to feel a twinge of admiration for how swiftly and efficiently the media turned a moment of history into a living myth. They didn't invent the curse, but they gave it teeth. And by the time the last headlines faded, the Pharaoh's wrath had become one of the 20th century's most enduring legends. What began as a dig in the desert had become a global haunting. Not because of the gods, but because of the headlines. As the tomb of Tutankhamun receded from the breaking news cycle and settled into cultural legend, it didn't fade, it deepened. And nowhere was that transformation more potent than within the strange and smoky circles of occultism. For spiritualists, mystics, and seekers of hidden knowledge, the so-called Pharaoh's curse wasn't just superstition, it was confirmation. Proof that ancient forces still moved in the world and that the veil between this life and the next had been pierced by careless hands. In the 1920s, occultism wasn't fringe, it was fashionable. Seances were held in candlelit parlors. Tarot decks were tucked into designer handbags. The Great War had left millions grieving, desperate to believe that something, anything, lay beyond the grave. Into that hunger, the story of the cursed tomb arrived like a divine parable: dig too deep, desecrate the sacred, and you will suffer. It echoed biblical warnings and esoteric mantras alike. Perhaps no figure embodies this fascination better than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Known worldwide as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Doyle was also a devoted spiritualist, having publicly embraced mediumship and life-after-death communication following the death of his son in the war. When asked about Lord Carnarvon's death, Doyle didn't equivocate. He blamed elemental spirits, ancient non-human guardians placed by Egyptian priests to protect sacred ground. These weren't ghosts, he insisted, but primal forces bound to their duty across millennia. The Egyptians knew far more than we do, he declared. Their curses were not metaphors. They were operations of law. Doyle's claim wasn't isolated. Within days, spiritualist circles began reporting premonitions, dreams, even visions of golden masks and warning voices. One medium claimed to have channeled the spirit of a priest of Anubis, who warned of more deaths to come. A London seance group swore that a presence had entered the room the night Carter breached the inner chamber, described as a shadow that bled light. Whether they believed it or were swept up in the moment hardly mattered. The story had become a living spell. And then came Aleister Crowley. The self-styled Great Beast Crowley was the most notorious occultist of his era, a man who blended Eastern mysticism, Western ritual, and a relentless appetite for provocation. When the story of the curse broke, Crowley saw not a warning, but an opportunity. He claimed with typical theatricality that he had known of the tomb's curse long before Carter's discovery. To his followers, he hinted that he possessed ancient knowledge, lost texts, and secret rituals meant to placate the astral intelligences of Egypt. Crowley's most disturbing contribution was his prediction made publicly in writing that others connected to the tomb would soon die. When another member of the excavation team passed a few months later, he didn't gloat. He simply nodded. As expected. Whether he truly believed in a metaphysical force or was simply riding the wave of attention is unclear. But one thing is certain: he gave the curse teeth among those already inclined to believe. Occult fascination extended beyond individuals. Orders like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Theosophical Societies, and Rosicrucian groups began referencing the Tutankhamun energy in their teachings. Some spoke of the tomb as a spiritual node, a place where energies were condensed, purified, and made dangerous through ritual burial. In this view, the tomb wasn't just a grave, It was a machine. And by opening it, Carter had reactivated something long dormant. A particularly strange claim emerged in 1927 when a French mystic named Madame Blavon insisted she had received a vision from the Eye of Horus, warning her to prevent Tutankhamun's artifacts from being transported to Europe. She failed, of course, but when a fire broke out in a museum warehouse weeks later, damaging several lesser-known items from the dig, her reputation surged in occultist circles. They called her a prophet. She called it divine alignment. What makes all this more than just fringe hysteria is how deeply it affected mainstream institutions. Museum curators became nervous about accepting artifacts. One European gallery canceled an entire Egyptian exhibition, citing unforeseen complications. Insurance companies quietly increased premiums on Egyptian loans. Even port authorities reported customs officers refusing to handle sealed crates marked Valley of the Kings. This occult lens also reshaped how people viewed previously mundane objects. Scarabs became talismans. Amulets took on new potency. Even reproductions of the death mask were said to cause bad dreams. The myth had become personal, each household its own chamber of secrets. And through it all, the tomb itself, cold, silent, half-emptied, sat in the desert watching. The narratives spun by spiritualists were never truly about Tutankhamun. They were about control, mystery, power. The idea that ancient Egypt held truths modernity had forgotten. Truths not written in textbooks, but whispered through incense and ritual. Whether any of these visions, predictions, or ceremonies had real-world consequences is beyond proving. But they undeniably deepened the legend. Because in the realm of the occult, belief is the force. And by the late 1920s, belief in the Pharaohs' curse was not just widespread, it was ritualized. So now we must ask, if the dead do speak and someone was listening, what exactly were they trying to say? Tutankhamun's tomb may have captured the world's attention, but it was far from the only resting place disturbed in the name of archaeology. Long before Carter's brush first swept dust from the boy king's golden death mask, explorers and treasure hunters had been prying open the sealed thresholds of Egypt's sacred dead. And curiously, or perhaps ominously, stories of misfortune, illness, and strange occurrences seemed to follow them too. In 1698, a French traveler named Benoit de Maillet wrote of mummified remains being dug up and shipped to Europe, only to be accompanied by a foul odor and unwholesome air that reportedly sickened several handlers. In the 19th century, mummy powder was ground and sold in apothecaries as a kind of miracle cure. Its use declined sharply after a rash of sudden illnesses blamed on impurity, but whispered by some to be something darker. Then there's the case of Giovanni Belzoni, the flamboyant Italian explorer who carted out half a dozen royal mummies during his early 1800s expeditions. Known for using battering rams and brute force to break into tombs, Belzoni made enemies in both academic and spiritual circles. After returning to Europe, he complained of recurring nightmares, paranoia, and according to some contemporaries, a fear of being followed by invisible presences. He died in his 40s from what was officially listed as dysentery. But a former assistant would later claim Belzoni had been haunted into fever. One of the most chilling stories came in 1869, when a tomb opened in the Dra Abu el Naga necropolis revealed dozens of skeletal remains arranged in unusual positions. The tomb was unsealed, documented, and sealed again. Within 2 years, every member of that dig team had either died or fallen gravely ill. One man's wife reportedly woke screaming each night, convinced she saw a gold-faced figure at the foot of the bed. Their neighbors moved out. Their story faded. Closer to the modern era during the excavation of the tomb of King Susenes, A lesser-known but equally lavish burial, the lead archaeologist Pierre Montet wrote cautiously of a presence felt during the removal of the king's silver coffin. While Montet himself lived well into his 80s, two members of his team died before the year's end. One collapsed on the train back to Cairo. The other developed sepsis from an infected hand wound, a minor injury that had occurred while handling funerary cloth. These incidents were never formally connected. No curses were declared. But within the Egyptology community, a quiet folklore developed. Some archaeologists began carrying charms, modern Christian or otherwise, when entering tombs. Others refused to work alone. There were stories of cameras failing, lights dimming, and animals avoiding specific chambers. Nothing scientific, nothing peer-reviewed, but the anecdotes stacked like stones. One obscure but notable example came from the Valley of the Queens. In the 1970s, archaeologists studying the tomb of Queen Nefertari reported a series of bizarre accidents: broken ladders, mysteriously corrupted film reels, even a minor rock slide near the entrance. No one died. But when one researcher suggested the team perform a small purification ritual, burning incense and reading aloud a passage from the pyramid texts, things reportedly calmed. The story never made headlines, but the archaeologists involved later confirmed the account in interviews, wryly, cautiously, but without contradiction. And it isn't just Egypt. Similar patterns appear in the Andes, where tombs of Incan priests have been tied to excavation tragedies. In China, the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, remains largely untouched. Officially, it's out of respect for preservation. Unofficially, it's because of the rumored rivers of mercury and traps described in ancient texts, threats dismissed as legend, until tests confirmed high mercury levels in the surrounding soil. Even today, no one rushes to crack it open. But what makes Egypt unique is the consistency. Again and again, from the earliest Arab chroniclers to modern European explorers, stories of strange deaths, diseases, and psychological breakdowns follow the opening of tombs. And while not every dig ends in disaster, enough have gone awry to keep the whispers alive. Some believe it's a matter of probability. The sheer number of tombs explored means that some misfortunes are inevitable. Others argue that working in hot, high-stress environments leads to exhaustion, illness, and error. But then there are those patterns that resist explanation: the sudden fevers, the freak infections, the accidents that align too neatly with sacred violations. And what of the tombs that remain sealed? There are many. Some are protected by local lore, others by government decree. A few have been lost again to sand and time. But the decision to leave them untouched often rests not on preservation science, but on fear. Quiet, unspoken, but real. In some cases, it's the locals who object. In others, it's the archaeologists themselves who walk away. It's tempting to view Tutankhamun's tomb as a singular event, a one-time convergence of history and hysteria. But the truth is more troubling. His curse may be the most famous, but it is not the only one. It is part of a lineage, a pattern written not just in stone, but in silence, in sickness, in the breathless pause before a sealed door is opened. And if these patterns are more than coincidence, then perhaps what we call a curse is not a superstition at all. Perhaps it is a message, one the ancients left us over and over again, and we keep refusing to listen. So after all this, where do we land? You've walked through dusty tombs and flickering newspaper columns, through toxic spores and whispered spells, through Carter's deliberate silence and the occult's loud embrace. The deaths are real. The fear is tangible. But the question still curls like smoke at the end of a match. Was there ever really a curse? Let's begin with the simplest explanation: coincidence. The argument goes like this: in any group of 30 or more people, particularly those working in strenuous conditions, some are bound to fall ill or die. In the 1920s, medicine had its limitations. Antibiotics were still experimental. Infections were often fatal. The mosquito bite that killed Carnarvon might have ended differently today. Respiratory illnesses were common, especially among those breathing in tomb dust. So yes, statistically, accidents and illnesses happen. The deaths that followed Tutankhamun's unsealing, while tragic, may simply have occurred within the spotlight's glare, amplified by media hunger and human pattern-seeking. This theory has logic on its side. It's testable, repeatable, comfortable in its ordinariness. But it doesn't explain why so many of those affected weren't in poor health, or why those deaths seem to cluster so tightly around the excavation timeline. And it certainly doesn't explain the eerie consistency of similar incidents in unrelated digs across centuries. Next comes the scientific hypothesis: toxins, molds, and ancient microbes long dormant in sealed environments. The tomb in this view becomes a kind of biological time capsule. When opened, spores like Aspergillus flavus or residues of embalming chemicals might escape into the air, targeting the lungs, the skin, or even the mind. This explanation provides a tangible mechanism for the deaths, one that doesn't require spirits or superstition. We know that similar toxins exist today in mold-infested buildings. We know that ancient mummification techniques used substances that are now considered carcinogenic. This theory makes a grim kind of sense, and yet, it doesn't fit all the facts. Howard Carter, most exposed of all, lived nearly 2 decades longer than Carnarvon. Some of the youngest, healthiest visitors were among the earliest to die, while older locals survived with no symptoms. The toxic tomb explains some of the damage, but leaves others untouched. In short, it doesn't explain the selectivity. Then there is the psychological model, the power of belief itself. The nocebo effect. The mind convinced of danger can trigger real physical decline. Stress hormones spike, sleep collapses, immunity falters. If you believe you've been cursed, the body may begin to behave as if it were true. Add to this the power of suggestion, rumors in the camp, media hysteria, spiritual warnings, and the impact becomes infectious. In this sense, the curse is not a supernatural force, but a meme that replicates in biology. It's a compelling idea. The curse becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The story seeps into the bloodstream. But again, there are outliers. Did a teenage servant know enough about curses to manifest his own drowning? Did a French radiologist trained in science fall prey to fear alone? And so we come to the most unsettling theory of all: the cover-up. Not supernatural, not microbial, but human. What if the deaths weren't accidents or reactions, but silences, enforced ones? Some historians have speculated that early 20th century Egyptology wasn't just about history. It was about ownership, politics, imperialism. Egypt was fighting for cultural autonomy, while British and French powers competed for prestige. Carter's excavation was the jewel in a colonial crown, and the stakes were enormous. If someone had died under unusual or criminal circumstances, would the public have been told the truth? Or would it have been easier to blame a curse, something exotic, unprovable, and above all convenient? Could it be that some deaths were sanitized, that a poisoning an argument, a mishandled artifact, resulting in exposure, any of these was erased beneath the shadow of a pharaoh's wrath? We'll never know. Records are missing, letters redacted. Carter's private journals remain selectively quoted. And then there's the final possibility, the one that defies theory altogether. That something real, something ancient and conscious responded to the desecration of its resting place. Not a monster, not a god. but a force. Bound not by malice, but by design. A guardian spell, a spiritual intelligence, an ancient alarm system activated not by intention, but by touch. A kind of cosmic immune response. That's the part no theory can prove, but no theory can quite dismiss either. Because whatever happened after the tomb was opened, whatever combination of mold, mind, myth, or manipulation, something did happen. People died. Others lived in fear. Museums hesitated. Reporters whispered. Even the desert itself seemed to hush. And across it all, the boy king lay in silence. Wrapped in gold, untouched by centuries' eyes, closed beneath a mask of divinity. If there is a curse, he never spoke it. He simply waited. And when disturbed, the world listened. Not every mystery needs a resolution. Some prefer to linger like incense in a sealed chamber, soft, fragrant, almost invisible. But if we've learned anything on this journey, it's that the line between superstition and science is sometimes little more than the edge of a shadow. And on the other side of that shadow waits a door still sealed. Maybe it's better that way. You step back now, away from the crumbling stone walls and the flickering torchlight, away from curses and coffins and the long corridor of coincidence that followed a single moment of discovery in 1922. The tomb is sealed again, at least in your mind, and the sand has begun to fall back over the doorway. Quietly, gently. Somewhere beneath that sand, beneath the varnished wood and gold leaf and carved falcons, lies the body of a boy, Tutankhamun, dead at 19. A king whose name meant nothing for centuries until his silence was broken and the world came to listen with fearful awe. He didn't ask for a curse. He didn't write the headlines. And yet somehow he became the center of a legend too large for even a dynasty to contain. What lingers most isn't the terror, it's the tension. That edge between what we can explain and what we feel in the back of the neck, in the shallow rise of breath when a sealed chamber opens and the air smells too old, too dry, too knowing. Whether or not a curse ever truly existed seems almost beside the point. What mattered was that people believed it could, and in that belief, the ancient world breathed again. And isn't that what all tombs hope for in the end? Not revenge, not fear, but remembrance. The Pharaoh's curse, if it ever lived, did not rise in rage, it whispered in unease. It pressed gently against the walls of certainty. It reminded us that not everything buried is meant to be understood. Some things endure not because they resist science, but because they haunt it. Persisting just at the edge of reason, like the faint echo of sandals on stone long after the procession has passed. And so you return to the surface, to a world still fascinated by pyramids, still drawn to the dead with trembling curiosity. You may not fear the curse, but tonight as you turn off the light, you may find yourself wondering, just for a moment, if something ancient was watching and waiting for you to look away.